This video is brought to you by Ground News. Last August, America passed the Inflation Reduction Act. With hundreds of billions of dollars worth of federal funding for green investments in one of the worst emitting countries in the world, it's probably done more for climate change than any other single piece of legislation in history. Originally, it was praised by the EU, who've been disappointed by America's unwillingness to act on climate issues. However, as the Europeans started reading the fine print, they've realised that the Inflation Reduction Act's massive subsidies weren't good news for European industry, which now has to either compete against subsidised American companies or move their manufacturing across the pond. So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at the Inflation Reduction Act itself, why it's upset the Europeans, and what the EU might do in response. So let's get straight into it. There are basically two things in the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, that the Europeans are grumpy with. The massive subsidies for industry, especially green industry, and the Made in America provisions. Let's start with the subsidies. The federal government estimates that the IRA contains something like $400 billion worth of loans, grants and federal tax incentives for energy and climate funding, to be spread out over the next 6 years or so. This is already an enormous number, but the actual figure could rise even higher, because some of the provisions in the IRA are uncapped, and an independent analysis by Credit Suisse suggests that the true figure could end up being somewhere nearer to $800 billion. For example, there's no limit on certain solar subsidies, which will apparently make American-made solar modules even cheaper than those made in China. If anyone shifts production to America, as you'd sort of expect, the federal government could end up basically subsidizing the global solar industry, which would be pretty expensive. On top of solar, the other green industries set to benefit from the IRA include electric vehicles, with each EV eligible for a tax credit of as much as $7,500 per vehicle for new vehicles and $4,000 for used vehicles. Nuclear power, which is set to receive a subsidy worth about 15% of the total cost of nuclear energy production. Clean hydrogen, i.e. hydrogen produced by zero carbon energy sources, which will receive a subsidy worth nearly 50% of the current cost, and basically any other zero carbon electricity source, which is eligible for a tax credit worth about $30 per megawatt hour of electricity produced. For context, solar and wind can already generate electricity for less than this, which is why the IRA should make American wind and solar globally competitive. As well as these subsidies, the IRA also includes a whole load of so-called Made in America provisions, which basically say that companies are only eligible for these tax credits if they manufacture some of the stuff in America or those countries that America has a free trade agreement with. For example, companies are only eligible for the full electric vehicle subsidy if they produce the batteries in the US. The idea here, clearly, is to try and move manufacturing and resource extraction back to the US. As geopolitical tensions have risen, America has become increasingly worried about its dependence on other countries, especially China, for certain resources. According to the latest IEA report, China alone accounts for the production of 90% of all rare earth elements, which are used in most high-end technology. 80% of polysilicon, which is used in solar panels, and about 60% of all lithium, copper, nickel and cobalt, all of which are used in batteries. China also dominates in bulk materials, producing more than half the world's aluminium, iron, cement and steel. This is why China produces at least a majority of literally every main component in solar panels, wind turbines and batteries. As a result, America sees the subsidies from the Inflation Reduction Act as a proportionate response to China's own unfair trade practices. Anyway, all of this annoys the Europeans because Europe is, or was, the world leader in many of these industries, and now European companies will either have to compete with heavily subsidized American companies or shift production to America. Many European politicians have also been dreaming of a sort of European Green New Deal, which would shift green manufacturing jobs back to Europe, but this has now become significantly more difficult. This all comes on top of the fact that America was already looking like a better place for industry to invest than the EU. The American economy looks stronger than Europe's at the moment, and thanks to its status as one of the world's largest energy producers, America enjoys way lower energy costs than Europe, which is important for green industries because they're very energy intensive. For context, natural gas and petrol costs literally 85% less in America at the moment. European politicians are clearly very worried about this. Belgium's Prime Minister claimed that the US was, quote, seeking to undermine EU industry, and Macron warned that the US risked fragmenting the West by subsidising American companies to the detriment of European ones. One of the reasons the Europeans are so worried is that there's not much they can do about it. At the moment, they're basically doing two things: asking Biden nicely to make exceptions for European companies, which is why Macron travelled to Washington in early December, and preparing for a subsidy war with the US. Last month, France and Germany published a joint paper on the EU's response to the IRA, which basically asked for more relaxed state aid rules to allow Europe to pump money into its green industry to make sure it stays competitive with the US. And the European Commission is apparently considering a block exemption from state aid limits for all green industry projects. Unfortunately, these aren't sustainable solutions. Biden only agreed to, quote, tweak the IRA for Europe, and if he loses in 2024, it's unlikely that a Republican president will be as sensitive to Europe's demands. Similarly, the EU just doesn't have the money or economic conditions to compete with the US in a subsidy race. For a whole load of reasons, including the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency and Europe's own current economic woes, the US just has way more fiscal space. It can borrow more money, and its money goes further, so the EU will really struggle to compete with the US in a who can spend more subsidy race. On top of that, a competitive subsidy regime would probably require a complete overhaul of the EU's state aid rules, which have, at least historically, been a point of contention between member states. So what else can the EU do? Well, a complete overhaul of the EU state aid rules and a new common European industrial policy might work, but it would require way more debt sharing and industrial cooperation at the European level. Alternatively, while it's not a popular idea in Brussels, the EU might have to accept some European companies moving their business to America and just find new parts of the supply chain to specialise in. In other words, instead of competing directly with the US, the Europeans could find new gaps in the market. Predicting what happens next between these two superpowers is incredibly difficult, and even tracking this story is difficult. Your expectations and approach to this rivalry will have a lot to do with your existing biases. Plus, we all know that algorithms work behind the scenes to determine the information we see online, and Ground News was created to give you access to as many diverse perspectives as possible. Ground News is a website and app that lets you compare how breaking news is covered around the world. For every story, you get bias, factuality, and ownership ratings for the news sources reporting on it. It's a fantastic way to access global news from diverse viewpoints, so you can see how international stories are being covered by news outlets on the ground or in neighbouring countries. For example, I can quickly compare headlines from government-affiliated sources to get a sense of how governments, even democratically elected ones, can steer media coverage. They have several editions to make sure you're getting news that's relevant to your region, including 4,000 news sources in the UK alone. If you want an even more customised experience, you can follow specific people, places, or topics that interest you most, like politics, Europe, and the economy. It really is a fascinating way to read the news, and unlike any news app out there. To give it a try, go to ground.news/TLDR. You can subscribe to get unlimited access to all features and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.